Hello everyone. In this lecture, we will be revising the cranial nerve nuclei and all the functional columns associated with them. Within this topic, you should be able to understand the embryological basis of the functional column, and then you should be able to enumerate and describe all the cranial nerve nuclei derived from each functional column, and you should be able to describe and enumerate all the functional components of each cranial nerve. As you all know that there are total 12 pairs of cranial nerves, out of which the first two pairs, that is olfactory and optic, arise from the forebrain, whereas the remaining 10 pairs arise from the brainstem. You also know that a cranial nerve may consist of only motor or efferent fibers, where efferent stands for E, making it a purely motor nerve, or it may contain only sensory or efferent fibers, where efferent stands for A, making it a purely sensory nerve, or it may contain both efferent and afferent type of fibers, making it a mixed cranial nerve. You also know that each cranial nerve may supply the somatic structures, where somatic stands for S, and the visceral structures, where visceral stands for V. Arrangement of the cranial nerve nuclei and the functional column they represent are linked with the development of the brain. Hence, first I will discuss in brief the development of the functional columns and the various cranial nerve nuclei associated with them. So you all know that central nervous system developed from the neural tube, the caudal part of which forms the spinal cord. During the development of the spinal cord, the lateral walls of the neural tube proliferate and become thick, whereas the dorsal and the ventral wall remain thin, forming a roof plate and a floor plate. Then the sulcus limitans appear in the developing spinal cord, and it will divide the proliferating lateral wall into a ventral basal lamina and a dorsal alar lamina. The ventral basal plate or basal lamina will contain cells that will be motor, whereas the dorsal alar plate will contain cells that will be sensory. Now, with the continued growth, the cells of each of these plates gets arranged into two longitudinal columns, the somatic column and the visceral column, with the visceral column lying close to the sulcus limitans. Thus, there are four functional components in the lateral wall of the spinal cord. These are from ventral to dorsal side, general somatic efferent, that is GSE, the general visceral efferent, that is GVE, the general visceral afferent, that is GVA, and the general somatic afferent, that is GSA. The general somatic efferent is primarily responsible for supplying the skeletal muscles, the general visceral efferent for supplying smooth muscles and glands, general visceral afferent to carry sensations from the viscera, and the general somatic afferent to carry the general sensations from the skin. The four components that we have just read were the components of the spinal nerve. Now, these four components were termed general because in the brain stem, three more components will be formed that are special to the cranial nerves, and they will be termed special. So now let us study and understand the development of the functional columns in the brainstem. During development of the hindbrain, the initial development is similar to that of the spinal cord. That is, the sulcus limitans divides the proliferating lateral wall into a basal plate with motor cells and alar plate with sensory cells. But here the roof plate widens to form the fourth ventricle. This causes the alar plate to come to lie lateral to the basal plate. Consequently, the functional components also undergo a directional change from ventrodorsal to mediolateral. So, the brainstem of the embryo will appear as seen in the given image. Here also, the cells of each of the plate will get arranged into a somatic and visceral component. But a third component known as the branchial or the special visceral column will appear in each of the alar and the basal plate between the somatic and the visceral component to supply the derivatives of the pharyngeal arches. Apart from this, a fourth component or a fourth column will appear in the lateralmost part of the alar plate to receive the sensations of hearing and balance. This component will be termed the special somatic afferent column. Thus, there are 7 functional columns in the brainstem from medial to lateral side, that is the general somatic efferent, special visceral efferent, general visceral efferent, general visceral afferent, special visceral afferent, general somatic afferent and special somatic afferent. At first, all of these columns are continuous throughout the brainstem, but later they break up into serially arranged cranial nerve nuclei. Some nuclei retain their position while some migrate deep into the brainstem. Please note that olfactory and the optic nerves are connected to the cerebrum and don't have any nuclei in the brainstem, whereas the remaining 10 cranial nerves have their nuclei in the brainstem. Also keep in mind that the several cranial nerves are connected to more than one nucleus, and some nuclei may contribute to more than one cranial. In this slide, I am summarizing all the 7 functional components, describing in brief their functions. So, the first column or the medialmost column is the somatic efferent column, and this column is responsible for supplying the somatic striated muscle. The second column is the branchial efferent or the special visceral efferent column, and this column is responsible for supplying the striated muscles derived from the pharyngeal arches. The third column is the general visceral efferent column, which is responsible for supplying the smooth muscles and glands. Then coming to the functional columns of the sensory functional columns, the first is the general visceral afferent column. This column is responsible for carrying the sensations from the viscera. Next is the special visceral afferent column. This column is responsible for carrying the taste sensations from the tongue. Next is the general somatic afferent column. This column is responsible for carrying the general sensations from the skin. And the last is the special somatic afferent column, which is responsible for carrying the sensations of hearing and balance from the ear. Now let us learn all the cranial nerve nuclei derived from each functional column. So coming to the first column, that is the somatic efferent column. The somatic efferent column, as I've told you, is responsible for supplying the striated muscles of somatic origin and has the following nuclei. The first nucleus is the oculomotor nucleus. This nucleus lies in the upper part of the midbrain at the level of the superior colliculus and is responsible for supplying all the extraocular muscles except lateral rectus and superior oblique. Next is the trochlear nucleus. It also lies in the midbrain but at the level of the inferior colliculus, and it is responsible for supplying the superior oblique muscle of the eyeball. Next is the abducent nucleus. This nucleus is present in the pons and it is responsible for supplying the lateral rectus muscle of the eyeball. Last nucleus of this column is the hypoglossal nucleus. This nucleus lies in the medulla, extending both into its open and closed part, and it is responsible for supplying all the muscles of the tongue except the palatoglossus. Coming to the next column, that is the special visceral efferent column. So as I've told you, this column is responsible for supplying the muscles derived from the pharyngeal arches. The first nucleus of this column is the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. The motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve lies in the upper part of the pons and supplies the muscles derived from the first pharyngeal arch. Next is the motor nucleus of the facial nerve. It lies in the lower part of the pons and it is responsible for supplying the muscles derived from the second pharyngeal arch. The third nucleus of this column is a composite nucleus known as the nucleus ambiguus. It lies in the medulla oblongata, extending both in the open and the closed part, and it receives this nucleus contributes fibers to glossopharyngeal, vagus and the accessory nerves and supplies the muscles of the pharynx and larynx derived from the third and the subsequent pharyngeal arches. The next column is the general visceral efferent column. This column is responsible for supplying the smooth muscles and the glands of the body. The nuclei of this column are: first is the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. This nucleus lies in the midbrain in close association with the oculomotor nucleus. The fibers of this nucleus pass through the oculomotor nerve and relay in the ciliary ganglion to supply the sphincter pupillae and the ciliaris muscle. Next is the superior and the inferior salivatory nucleuses. These nucleus lies in the lower part of the pons just above the pontomedullary junction. The superior salivatory nucleus sends fibers into the facial nerve and its chorda tympani branch that relays in the submandibular ganglion to supply the submandibular and the sublingual glands, whereas the inferior salivatory nucleus sends fibers into the glossopharyngeal nerve that relays in the otic ganglion to supply the parotid gland. Apart from these salivatory nucleuses, there is one more cluster of neuron known as the lacrymatory nucleus located near them. The fibers, preganglionic fibers arising from this, pass through the facial nerve, its greater petrosal branch, and then relay in the pterygopalatine ganglion to supply the nasal, palatine and the lacrimal glands. The last nucleus of this column is the dorsal nucleus of the vagus. It forms an elongated column that extends throughout the most part of the length of the medulla. This nucleus is responsible for supplying all the thoracic and abdominal viscera, and the ganglion concerned are present in the walls of the viscera supplied. Coming to the sensory columns. The next two columns, that is the general visceral afferent and the special visceral afferent, will be considered together as they are represented by a single nucleus, that is nucleus of Tractus solitarius. This nucleus forms an elongated column and extends into both open and closed part of the medulla. The upper part of the nucleus is concerned with the taste sensation, whereas the lower part of the nucleus receives the general sensations from the vagus and the glossopharyngeal nerve. The upper part of the nucleus receives the fibers from the 7th, 9th and 10th cranial nerve, and it is frequently referred to as the gustatory nucleus. The next column is the general somatic afferent column, and it is represented by the sensory nuclei of the trigeminal nerve. The three sensory nuclei of the trigeminal nerve are: first is the chief sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, which lies in the upper part of the pons, and it is concerned mainly with the tactile sensibility from the region to which this nerve is distributed. Then the next nucleus is the spinal nucleus. This nucleus extends from the chief sensory nucleus down into the medulla and up to the upper two segments of the spinal cord. Its lower end is continuous with the substantia gelatinosa of the spinal cord. This nucleus is mainly concerned with the pain and temperature sensations. The third nucleus is the mesencephalic nucleus, which extends cranially from the upper end of the chief sensory nucleus into the midbrain. Now, this nucleus is responsible to carry the proprioceptive impulses from the muscles of mastication and possibly also from the muscles of the eyeball, face, tongue and teeth. Coming to the last column, that is the special somatic afferent column. This column consists of two nuclei. The cochlear nuclei are two in number. There's dorsal and ventral, which are placed dorsal and ventral to the inferior cerebellar peduncles respectively at the level of the pontomedullary junction. The second nucleus is the vestibular nucleus, which lies under the lateral part of the floor of the fourth ventricle. It lies partly in the medulla and partly in the pons, and consists of four distinct nuclei, which are medial, lateral, superior and inferior. Now, the cochlear nuclei are responsible for carrying the sensations of hearing, whereas the vestibular nuclei are responsible for carrying the sensations of the balance. Having considered all the cranial nerve nuclei and their connections, now I will explain the functional component of each of the cranial nerve individually. Coming to the first cranial nerve, that is the olfactory nerve. The fibers of this nerve are classified under the special somatic afferent category. It is located, as I have already told you, that the nerve originates from the forebrain. It is distributed to the olfactory mucosa and performs the function of smell. The next cranial nerve, that is the optic nerve. It also has functional component as special somatic afferent. It is located in the forebrain, distributed to the ganglionic cells of and performs the function of vision. Coming to the third cranial nerve, that is the oculomotor nerve. This cranial nerve has the following functional components. First is the general somatic efferent or GSE. The nucleus concerned is the oculomotor nucleus, which as I have told you is located in the midbrain, distributed to all the extraocular muscles except lateral rectus and the superior oblique, and is helpful in eye movement. Second component is the general visceral efferent component. The nucleus concerned is the Edinger-Westphal nucleus located in the midbrain. The ganglion concerned with this nucleus is the ciliary ganglion. The muscles supplied are the sphincter pupillae and the ciliaris muscle, which helps in pupillary constriction and lens accommodation. The third column is the general proprioceptive or general somatic afferent column. The nucleus concerned is the mesencephalic nucleus, which is located in midbrain, distributed to the extraocular muscles and helps in proprioception. Coming to the fourth cranial nerve, that is the trochlear nerve. The first functional component of this cranial nerve is general somatic efferent. The nucleus concerned is trochlear nucleus, which is located in the midbrain, distributed to the superior oblique muscle, which helps in eye movement. The second component is the general proprioceptive or the general somatic afferent column. The nucleus concerned is the mesencephalic nucleus, which is located in the midbrain, distributed to the superior oblique muscle and helps in proprioception. Coming to the fifth cranial nerve, that is the trigeminal nerve. The functional component is the special visceral efferent column. The nucleus concerned with the special visceral efferent column is the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, which is located in the pons, distributed to the muscles of the first pharyngeal arch, for example muscles of mastication, and thus helps in chewing, etc. The second component of this cranial nerve is the general somatic afferent column. There are three nucleus concerned with the general somatic afferent column. Chief sensory nucleus located in the pons, the spinal nucleus which is located in the medulla extending up to the upper two segments of the spinal cord, and the mesencephalic nucleus which is located in the midbrain. The ganglion concerned with these three nucleuses is the trigeminal ganglion. The chief sensory and the spinal nucleus fibers are distributed to the scalp and the face and helps in carrying the general exteroceptive sensation from these areas, whereas the mesencephalic nucleus is distributed to the extraocular muscles, muscles of mastication, muscles of tongue, etc. and helps in carrying the proprioceptive sensations from ocular, facial and the lingual muscles. Coming to the sixth cranial nerve, that is the abducent nerve. The functional component are first the general somatic efferent column, which is the nucleus concerned is the abducent nucleus located in the pons, distributed to the lateral rectus muscle and helps in eye movement. The second component of this cranial nerve is the general proprioceptive column or the general somatic afferent column. The nucleus concerned is the mesencephalic nucleus, which is located in the midbrain, distributed to the lateral rectus muscle and helps in proprioception. Coming to the functional components of the seventh cranial nerve, that is the facial nerve. The first functional component is the special visceral efferent component. The nucleus concerned is the facial nucleus, which is located in the pons, distributed to the muscles derived from the second pharyngeal arch, for example muscles of the facial expression, and helps in the facial expression, tension of the stapes, etc. The second functional component of this cranial nerve is the general visceral efferent column. The nucleus concerned with the general visceral efferent column are two. First is the lacrimatory nucleus and the superior salivatory nucleus. Both the nucleuses are located in the pons. The ganglion concerned with the lacrimatory nucleus is the pterygopalatine ganglion. The fibers are distributed to the lacrimal, nasal and the palatine glands and helps in the lacrimation and mucus secretion. Whereas the ganglion concerned with the superior salivatory nucleus is the submandibular ganglion, which is distributed to the sublingual and the submandibular gland and helps in salivation. Then next component is the special visceral afferent component. The nucleus of this component is the nucleus of Tractus solitarius, which is located in the medulla. The ganglion concerned is the geniculate ganglion. It is distributed to the anterior two-thirds of the tongue except the circumvallate papilla and carries the taste sensation from this region. The next component is the general visceral afferent component. The nucleus concerned is the nucleus of tractus solitarius again, which is located in the medulla. The ganglion concerned is the geniculate ganglion. The fibers are distributed to the middle ear, nasal cavity and the soft palate and carries the visceral sensation from these regions. The last component of this cranial nerve is the general somatic afferent component. The nucleus is the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, which is located in the medulla. The ganglion concerned is the geniculate ganglion. It is distributed to the external auditory meatus and the area posterior to the ear and carries general sensation from these regions. Coming to the 8th cranial nerve, the functional component of the 8th cranial nerve is the special somatic afferent column. The nucleus concerned are first the dorsal and the ventral cochlear nucleus, which is located in the medulla, or rather pontomedullary junction. The ganglion concerned is the spiral ganglion, which is distributed to the organ of corti and performs the function of hearing. The second nucleus of this cranial nerve is the vestibular nucleus or the vestibular complex, which is again located in the medulla, basically at the pontomedullary junction. The ganglion concerned is the vestibular ganglion, distributed to the utricle, saccule and the semicircular canal of the ear and helps in performing the function of the maintenance of equilibrium. Coming to the 9th cranial nerve, that is the glossopharyngeal nerve. It has the following functional components. First is the special visceral efferent column. The nucleus concerned with this column is the nucleus ambiguous, which is located in the medulla, distributed to the muscles derived from the third pharyngeal arch, that is the stylopharyngeus and the pharyngeal constrictor. It helps in performing the function of swallowing. The next functional component is the general visceral efferent column. The nucleus concerned with this is the inferior salivatory nucleus, which is located in the medulla. The ganglion concerned with this is the otic ganglion, which is distributed to the parotid gland and helps in salivation. The third component of this cranial nerve is the special visceral afferent column. The nucleus concerned with this column is the nucleus of tractus solitarius, which is located in the medulla. The ganglion concerned with this component is the inferior ganglion of the glossopharyngeal nerve. The fibers are distributed to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, the circumvallate papilla and the adjacent pharyngeal wall. It helps in carrying the taste sensation from these regions. The fourth component is the general visceral afferent column. The nucleus concerned is again the nucleus of tractus solitarius, which is located in the medulla. The ganglion concerned is the inferior ganglion of the glossopharyngeal nerve. The fibers are distributed to the middle ear, pharynx, tongue, carotid sinus and the soft palate, carrying the visceral sensation from these regions. The last component of this cranial nerve is the general somatic afferent column. The nucleus concerned is the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, which is located in the medulla. The ganglion concerned are the superior ganglion of the glossopharyngeal nerve. Fibers are distributed to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, the soft palate and the auditory tube, carrying the general sensation from these regions. Coming to the 10th cranial nerve, that is vagus. The first functional component of this cranial nerve is the special visceral efferent column. The nucleus concerned with this component is nucleus ambiguous, which is located in the medulla, distributed to the muscles of the larynx and the pharynx, performs the function of the phonation. The second component is the general visceral efferent component. The nucleus concerned with this is the dorsal motor nucleus of the 10th cranial nerve, which is located in the medulla. The ganglion concerned are present in the thoracic and the abdominal autonomic plexuses. The fibers are distributed to the thoracic and the abdominal viscera and helps in gland secretion and the peristalsis. The third component is the special visceral afferent component. The nucleus concerned with this is the nucleus of tractus solitarius, which is located in the medulla oblongata. The ganglion concerned is the inferior ganglion of the vagus nerve. The fibers are distributed to the epiglottis and helps in carrying taste sensation from this region. The fourth component is the general visceral afferent column. The nucleus concerned is the nucleus of tractus solitarius, which is located in the medulla. The ganglion concerned is the inferior ganglion of the 10th cranial nerve. The fibers are distributed to the thoracic and the abdominal viscera and helps in carrying the visceral sensation from these regions. The last component is the general somatic afferent column. The nucleus concerned with this column is the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, which is located in the medulla. The ganglion concerned is the superior ganglion of the vagus nerve. The fibers are distributed to the area posterior to the ear, external acoustic meatus, etc., and helps in carrying the general sensation from these regions. Then last is the spinal accessory nerve. The spinal accessory nerve has the functional component as the special visceral efferent component. The nucleus concerned with this is the nucleus ambiguus, which is located in the medulla. The fibers are distributed to the laryngeal muscle, the sternocleidomastoid, and the trapezius muscle. The laryngeal muscles helps in phonation, whereas the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscle helps in head and shoulder movements. So coming to the last cranial nerve, that is the hypoglossal nerve. It has two components. The first is the general somatic efferent. The nucleus concerned with this is the hypoglossal nucleus, which is located in the medulla. It is distributed to the muscles of the tongue except palatoglossus and helps in performing the tongue movement. Next is the general proprioceptive or the general somatic afferent. The nucleus concerned with it is the mesencephalic nucleus, which is located in the midbrain. This nucleus helps in the fibers are distributed to the muscles of the tongue, carrying the proprioceptive sensations from them. This was all about this topic. Thank you.